Welcome to today's discussion on the topic of anonymization of patient information, including patient information contained in medical images. Today's discussion is a summary to review key points addressed in two recent Laurel Bridge white papers on the same topic, and will focus on the DICOM de-identification and re-identification as defined by the DICOM Part 15 standard. I am Greg Muller, Director of Business Development at Laurel Bridge Software, and happy to introduce the primary participants in today's discussion. Joining me are Herman Osterwijk, President and founder of OTech Incorporated. Herman is an industry icon as a teacher consultant on medical informatics, specializing in PACS, DICOM, and HL7. He has taught extensively on these topics and has written more than 10 textbooks and study guides. Also joining me is Chris Hoffman. Chris is a senior software engineer at Laurel Bridge who manages the implementation of the DICOM Part 15 standard in Laurel Bridge Software's imaging workflow solutions, specifically how Laurel Bridge implements the DICOM de-identification and re-identification of patient information. Thank you for participating today, Herman and Chris. Let's get started. Chris?
Thank you, Greg, for the introduction, and thank you, Herman, for taking the time to join us and discuss anonymization as it pertains to medical imaging. First question, what is medical imaging anonymization and what does it involve?
Okay, Chris, yeah, thank you for that question. So when you think about anonymization, or if you look up the word anonymous, what it really means is unknown authorship or origin. So what it means to do anonymization of medical information means that we want to make sure that we cannot trace it back to its origin, or we cannot trace it back to the author of that particular image. Which includes not only the author, but also includes the patient that it relates to. So what does it now involve, the anonymization? It involves removing the information, and you need to make sure that you do not take away too much or too little. If you take away too much, that means the data could potentially become not useful anymore. Because if we have a data set we want to use for a certain purpose, it might be important to know what was the age of that person, right? Was this a male, female infant? So we want to make sure that depending on the particular application, we keep some of the information in there. But if we take away too little, then we could potentially trace it back again. So the challenge is this balance between too much and too little. Okay, next question.
Thank you. What are some of the top challenges in medical imaging anonymization?
So the challenge is, we talked about finding the right information, not too much and not too little. And the challenge is how to find the information, right? Find the information that relates and can be used to trace back the patient or the author or the origin. So you could think about, when you look at the metadata, which is the DICOM header that goes with the image. And so the first glance you would look at maybe obvious pieces of information such as patient ID, patient name, right? So some of them are obvious, they are well defined by the DICOM standard, and so you take it away. So that will be almost like the first phase, the first pass, so to speak. However, there's not only standard tags, we call them, tags are the pieces of information in the header, but also non-standard tags. That means a vendor might potentially put information in their own proprietary tag that, again, could reveal the patient identity or where it came from. And you have to also realize it's not necessarily directly just the patient name. It could be sometimes a combination of the accession number that identifies the order, the specific date and time that the procedure was performed, combined with the name of the institution and the particular CT or MRI or device, right? So sometimes a combination of information could also trace back to the origin. So we have standard tags, we have non-standard tags, and then there are free text fields that a technologist can use to put information in. I've seen this quite a bit. I work with some of the clinical trial companies, and you would see, okay, patient information, of course, but you see sometimes study comment fields, right? And there would be a name in there, right? So we have free text fields, then also overlays. What is an overlay? Somebody might actually, put information on the in the case of as an overlay will be text fields that are separately stored with the DICOM header that could potentially also be used to go back to the trace. So these are standard, non-standard text fields, overlays. But now, let's say there's a study and it includes dermatology or a picture of a face, or some people don't even think about it. Let's say you have a series of CT images. You can load them in any open source software viewer and do a 3D reconstruction. And I will bet you that you can recognize a person's face. Right? So we have 3D as well, reconstruction that can be used. And then last but not least, something kind of interesting, if somebody has an implant or a pacemaker, it's really important to trace these body parts, so to speak, foreign body parts with a part number. Well, what if we take an X-ray? The part number will show up. So somewhere you down the line, you can actually take, if you have a list of part numbers, you can trace it back to that particular person. So it's very, very challenging to find all of the information and in these headers. Now, you can say, okay, well, let's take everything out. But then again, we don't want to take out too much because then the data becomes unusable. So the challenge is you need to almost have a dynamic or real-time or a dynamic or configurable solution that says, okay, for this particular use case, we want to take out this. Or this particular use case, we want to take out this. And the requirements of what to take out and what not to take out are really determined by the different use cases and the different cases and the different clients that are using that information. Thank you. Let's go to the next question.
Herman, just real quick, you bring up an interesting point about private tags.
Right.
So as an organization might be considering what information they need or don't need, they might not even be aware that things exist in private tags to support various workflows that are vendor specific. So having a solution that not only can you tell it which tags and private tags you want to remove, but a solution that can actually determine if there are private tags and do something with those as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, and again, a solution to say, let's take all of the private tags out, it's not necessarily always the best solution either, because it could be that for this particular application that they might need some of these private tags again. And again, the whole private tags is a whole problem by itself, because even although it will be good practice for a vendor to document the private tags in the conformance statement so you can look them up, not everyone does that. And then, of course, there are some research institutions that add their own private tags because they do their own research and they do their own stuff. So private tags is a whole problem by itself. Next question.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's certainly been our experience that each workflow is indeed unique and requires special attention to ensure the complete protection and removal of protected health information.
Yeah.
Now, you've mentioned de-identification and its significance in the removal of protected health information. Can you elaborate on re-identification and what makes it important?
Yeah, so the opposite of de-identification is re-identification. So when we have a set of a data set, a study, and let's say we de-identify it, and let's say we send it to the cloud. Right? Or a hospital said we have a relationship with maybe Google or Amazon or some kind of a cloud provider that provides a public AI algorithm. And of course, when you send it up to the cloud after you de-identify it, when you get the results back, you need to add it back to the study, right? So we need to re-identify it. So a good example where we need to do not only de-identification but also re-identification is when we have when we submit or when we exchange the information through some public means that is publicly accessible. There's also federal guidelines for example, for clinical trials, that you have to be able to trace back the origin. Because one of the things that the federal government is very concerned about is that we have these clinical trials with data sets that we can prove some point in time when you do an audit that you can go back, okay, this was a real person, right? And this was a real person that really was part of this particular clinical trial. So we don't have synthetic data or make-up data, or synthetic data is what people, create from existing images and they mix and match, and there's all kind of cool stuff you can do in computers, but this is not something we want to do when we have a clinical trial that potentially would lead to an approval of a pharmaceutical drug that impacts people's lives. So re-identification, important for AI results coming back and for also clinical trials. Thank you. Next question.
It's certainly been our experience that those requirements for re-identification have made each case particularly challenging.
Yeah.
Now, in your experience, what are some of the most common use cases for anonymization?
Yeah, so one of the things that people always ask is, the users always ask is to have teaching files. So this is a typical COVID-19 case. This is a typical case of breast cancer. This is a typical case of, and actually, importantly enough, for example, if you go to the United States, there are diseases that are very prevalent in other parts of the world that you don't see on a day-to-day basis here. Like, how often do you see a malaria patient, in New York City? Unless this was an immigrant that just came out of Africa, or there was a volunteer that just did some work in Ghana or wherever there is malaria, right? Or so it's really important to be able to have a catalog or a library of specific teaching files for cases, in particular the ones that are not only for teaching residents, but also for very experienced people that never seen or that didn't see as often a case of malaria or some of the diseases that are, endemic in so many other countries. And of course, when we have teaching files, that's let's say on the PAC system, all these cases, we need to identify them, and we need to make sure that the patient information is removed. Now, teaching files are relatively easy because they're kind of static, and we're not too worried about some of the clinical information, which is critical for some of the clinical trials. So second use case would be clinical trials, and they're a little bit more complex because sometimes they might want a set of images, right, for people with a particular age, with let's say 30 and 40 years old for a particular disease. And so depending on the clinical trial, certain information has to be either kept, and so that's really hard to determine. It's almost like you need this dynamic, configurable solution again. And then the last but not least, the AI, artificial intelligence, a big application right now. I was just reading this morning again another article of how some of these AI algorithms perform so poorly. The only reason, because AI is self-learning, right? So we need to have data. We need to teach the AI, its intelligence, so to speak. But the problem is that a lot of AI companies using very poor data sets. Well, they're based on a data set that is, let's say, from China, or from even as far as the East Coast. If you have a data set, an AI algorithm that's trained on East Coast data, they've actually proven already that it doesn't work in Cleveland, Ohio, or in Dallas, Texas, right? So we need a lot of data sets, right, for AI, and not only for the training of the algorithms, but even importantly, after we train the algorithm, so we think we're good, then we need to do a verification at a local, at the local site. So we have training data sets, verification data sets, test data sets, all of them has to be anonymized. So AI is a big application, and particularly with that coming up, that we will need a lot of de-identification. Next question.
Yeah, Herman, I will add to that on the situation of the AI algorithm. What we have found, our experience is many of the AI companies, some have received their FDA approval already and are going towards commercial implementations. Others, however, are in the FDA approval process, and they need to move data, usually in large chunks, as you described, anonymously to their algorithms in order to demonstrate to the federal government that their algorithms are, worthy of approval.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thanks
Yeah,
for sharing.
big challenge. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That's absolutely one of the biggest questions that we've had the hospitals ask is, how do we intend to migrate this data in a way that still retains the core patient information that needed without exposing that same information.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that makes it challenging. And a lot of tricks, for example, if you need a data set, for example, you need to correlate, for example, before and after the treatment. And let's say the examination was done on May 1st, and you have another exam that was done in June 1st. And if you need to remove those dates, well, one of the things you can do is shift to say, okay, well, let's say we go all the way back to all the studies always starts on January 1st, and then we shift to second. So there's a lot of tricks you can do it to still keep the context. Right. Another one is, for example, instead of the birth date, but we still need to know kind of approximately how old it is. So you sometimes actually have to add tags, patient age. The patient is 39 years old. So without having to know that the patient was born, the birth date was on, January 1st. Right. So yeah, great. Okay. Next question.
Yeah. One of the things that we also see, Herman, most people think about anonymization as a per study basis. I need to get this study anonymized and sent, but as you know, and we have seen, many of the algorithms require not only the current study that they're evaluating, but relevant prior exams. And not only do the prior exams have to be anonymized, but they have to be associated in a way that they hang or are linked properly in the AI algorithm.
Yeah. So that makes it challenging. So you could actually have multiple data sets, of course, and then from different modalities like a CT and an MRI and an X-ray, and they need to maintain the same context. So I think that's a good point. Anonymization. They sometimes think, okay, we do it for one image. No, you need to do it, and you have to anonymize the whole context, the whole, lifespan,
patient record, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
What type of guidance do the medical imaging standards provide in these cases?
So there is some guidance, and in the standards, and there are basically two main standards. There's the DICOM standard that tells you how to, encode the DICOM header, and there's the IHE standard on integrating the healthcare enterprise, but basically puts the standards in a use case perspective and approach them from them. And it says of this DICOM standard and HL7 and other standards, this is how we're going to apply them in a specific use case. So let's just first talk about DICOM, the DICOM standard. So DICOM has, I think by now 22 parts or so, and one specific section, part 15. So if you go to the DICOM standard, dicom.org, you pick up part 15, and it has a recommendation or identification of all the tags that potentially could have patient information or could potentially be used to go back to that origin. And then again, like I said earlier, it's helpful as a start, but if you take all of that information and all of these tags and you take them out, it becomes again not necessarily useful for many use cases. So it's the DICOM part 15 is a very good start, and actually to start out with, and then use that as a start, and then say, depending on the use case, what is it that we might have to keep in? Or depending on the use case, what is the relationship of this particular study with other studies, so I keep the clinical context still there, right? So part 15 is a good start. And then we have IHC. IHC is actually more putting that in the perspective of a use case. So basically it specifies how a set of images or a set of studies can be submitted. And we call in IHC, we call them the different actors. So from one actor to the other, well, how can we submit it or exchanged or exported? And how can we describe the potential action to be taken for the set of images? And we do that in a form of what we call in DICOM a structured report or a key object selection document. And I basically said, this is for clinical trial. So it puts it in the context of a specific use case. So even if a particular vendor say, I support this TCE profile, we call it, the TCE profile in IHE. So you can expect a set of images with a structured report that describes together. It's almost like a packaging together, and that helps it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, one of the things also that not obviously the DICOM and IHE are good standards to start with, but what we have found is each institution and each region or country might overlay some of their own requirements. You know, we find that some institutions are okay with this set of standards or this set of anonymization tags, while others are not and require further, anonymization. So it's very specific. And I think you alluded to that earlier as to why this is challenging. It's not a one size fits.
Yeah, and actually, and the reason that we have a lot of various different requirements is that, of course, there's a lot of various different regulations. There are state regulations, there are federal regulations, there are United States regulations. We have the HIPAA here, we have the GDPR, in Europe, and then just for example, we were trying to deploy an AI algorithm in Ethiopia as part of a humanitarian work we do. And so basically we found that, okay, we worked with the hospital, said, you sent the images up to the cloud. And then they said, what do you mean cloud? Yeah, we sent the images up to the cloud. And they said, we can't just do that because where's the cloud? Well, it's just in the United States. No. This is the role we have in our country for, information that has to be anonymized, cannot be shared. And I mean, there are probably 80% overlap because everybody knows that to anonymize the patient name, but there's always the 10 or 20% that makes it hard and requires customization. So depending on the locale, Greg, you're absolutely right, because we have different regulations that depending on where we are, right? Not only different regulation, but also different requirements and different use cases. So some things that might be, again, very important here might not be important in other countries and other continents. So global deploying these methodologies, even between different states, of course. California is different than New York City, than Texas. I mean, we all know that different states have a different perspective on what could be shared and what is private or not. So even in the United States, we have these kind of issues. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Those examples really showcased the difficulty and the importance anonymization plays. And again, thank you very much for your time in answering these questions.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, Herman, Chris, thank you very much. This was a very informative discussion. I hope our viewers find it equally as informative and helpful. If anybody does have questions for Laurel Bridge and or Herman, feel free to submit your questions to info@laurelbridge.com. And again, this conversation was based on 2 published white papers, which are available on the Laurel Bridge website, as well as I believe on the OTEC Incorporated website. So thanks, everyone. Hope to see you again soon in another lively discussion on key important topics.
Thank you.
Take care.